Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Herbst. I'm president of American Jewish University. We'll begin our programming in just a few moments. We're just waiting for everyone to join us. Thank you so much for being part of today's AJU programming. Again, I'm Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University. We'll begin in just a few moments. We have a very large audience today, I'm delighted to say, and we're just waiting for everyone to join the webinar, and then we'll begin. And in just a moment, we'll begin our programming as part of AJU's Bayahad Together. Just a few moments, and we're just waiting for the last few people to join the webinar. Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Herbst. I'm president of American Jewish University, and I'd like to welcome you to the most recent program in our Bayahad Together, spirited by AJU series. Since the beginning of the pandemic and the economic dislocations, AJU has attempted to provide a digital platform that educates, entertains, and informs the community about the issues of today and about all of the issues that the Jewish community and the community at large is concerned with. We've been delighted to welcome tens of thousands of people to our programs, including many who had not previously been part of our circle. Thank you so much for joining with us. As part of our Bayahad Together series, we have a series of programs called Justice We Shall Pursue. In light of the extraordinary debates around racism, around structural bias against African Americans, AJU has committed itself to developing a series of programs that uses the university's power as a convener to explore the controversial issues of today and try to reach greater understanding. I'm delighted, as part of that program, to welcome Dr. Erroll Southers, professor of the practice at USC's School of Public Policy, to today's program on racism, protest, and police reform. Dr. Southers is a law enforcement veteran, having served as a police officer in Santa Monica, as Homeland Security Advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger, as an FBI special agent, and also as an assistant chief at LAX. He has a broad perspective on law enforcement, having served at the local, state, and federal levels that I think it's fair to say few others have in the United States today. At USC, he's been involved in cutting-edge research on counterterrorism, on Homeland Security, on police reform, on school violence abatement that has had an extraordinary effect on our society. I'll be talking with Erroll for about 20-25 minutes, and then we welcome your questions. Please submit them through the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. And we'd be delighted to also have your voice explore the critical issues of today. Prof, thanks so much for joining us today. I know how busy you are, and it's really an honor to be able to host you on AJU's programming.
Well, thank you for having me. Actually, it's an honor to be here. I really appreciate it.
That's very kind. There are so many issues, and obviously we could talk for a long time about racism, protests, and police reform. Let me go to what I think is still the essential question that's motivated so much discussion, so much debate, so much protest. George Floyd was killed because a policeman kneeled on his neck for over 8 minutes while 3 other policemen watched. How could that happen in America in 2020?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And if we look at what's happened over the past several years in particular, as it relates to specifically unarmed African-American males who died at the hands of the police. What we watched that evening or that day was a human being have his life extinguished, as you've mentioned, over 8 minutes by someone kneeling on his neck, and he didn't care, having people film him while he did it, and he didn't care, pleading with him to let him up, and he didn't care, and then cavalierly putting his hand in his pocket as it happened. I don't think, with all of the incidents we've had over the last several years that have usually occurred in a split second involving a shooting or something like that and the use of deadly force, that we've ever seen anyone actually executed under the color of authority in this country, much less in this year. And I think that's what's changed the paradigm with regards to people's response to this incident, both domestically and around the world.
There has been debate, as you said, especially about police violent actions against unarmed African-American males for years. To simplify the debate, it's been about some claims that these were rotten apples versus other people who see racism deeply embedded in police forces. Given your experience, individually, professionally, what's your perspective on this?
Well, at some point, as a colleague of mine who's in North Carolina and the sheriff said a couple of weeks ago, law enforcement has to say the 6 words: we are part of the problem. And my experience has been, and I'll tell you, it's a great question because it's the reason I got into law enforcement. My mom, lived to be 85 years old, and in 85 years, I only remember her swearing one time in my life. And it was after I got stopped by some officers. I was walking with some friends down the street on the sidewalk, and we got stopped, and we got harassed, and he had some choice words. Unfortunately, there wasn't any use of force, and I did the right thing. We all had to talk as young African Americans do with their parents about what to do when you're stopped by the police. Went home and told my mom, and she called the station, and basically they told her it didn't happen. And after that happened a few times, my dad finally said, you can't change the castle from outside the moat. And so one of my reasons for wanting to be in law enforcement was to hope I could be that change agent. I don't know how long law enforcement is going to get away with saying that 99.9% are good, because we're seeing too many incidents of this happening. We saw incidents of this happen after George Floyd. We saw it in response to some of the protests and violence because of George Floyd's death. And I've kind of chalked it up to this. I've now say to people, police officers didn't necessarily get worse. Cell phone technology got better. And now we're starting to see it. Is it systemic? Well, anytime you can have an officer change the course of someone's life through a citation, through an arrest, by putting them in a database, because of what color they are, someone has to agree that there's some systematic racism or systemic racism in those departments, and that it's being allowed to happen. And we can have a discussion, obviously, about chiefs and accountability and agencies and accountability, but typically, officers do what they think they can get away with sometimes.
A lot of these incidents, by no means all, have occurred in metropolitan areas. Those areas have seen racial diversification of the political leadership and of the police leadership in recent years, although not necessarily of the rank and file of police. It's a broad generalization, but do you think the situation of structural racism is worse? Is it getting better, but we know more? How do you describe it?
I think we know more, and unfortunately, I think it's worse. The bad news is that people feel that they can be emboldened now to say what they want, when they want, under this guise of not being politically correct, when perhaps years ago, they might have had those thoughts, they may have had those feelings, but they wouldn't voice them. We're in a different time now. I never thought I'd be at an age since I was a kid that I'd be out in public and have to worry about someone looking at me and saying the N-word. I just thought that of all the things that had passed, that might be passed. Not suggesting that they wouldn't say it, but they wouldn't say it to me. And we're back there again. So I have to agree to a certain extent, it's worse. But I also agree with your statement that we certainly know more. And everybody knows more now. And the enlightenment of a lot of people, I've gotten calls from friends I haven't talked to in decades to say to me, after they apologize, and I say, don't apologize, you can't be sorry for something you may not have known about. But to say to me, did this always happen to you? And I say, yeah. And they say, well, why didn't you say something? I said, so how would that have changed our relationship if I did? And that's how the conversations have begun.
Is it reasonable, do you believe, for an African-American male in urban areas to fear the police more than see them as a force of protection?
I think it is reasonable. Typically, when the police are in some of those neighborhoods, it's always because of a response to a call. It may sometimes result in someone going to jail. And it's for that reason that I'm a huge proponent of those programs that policing agencies have to bridge that gap. I was a PAL kid in New Jersey, Police Activities League. I was around police officers as a young kid, and they weren't arrest situations. We have a cadet program in most agencies. We have an explorer program in most agencies. I think it's important for young men and women of color to see police officers in situations where they're not responding to a call, where there isn't a use of force. They can build a relationship through academic programs, athletic programs, and see them as someone they can talk to, perhaps someone they can be mentored by. I think the reason you're seeing the diversity of law enforcement change is because you're seeing those young men and women from those neighborhoods that were being policed join those departments because they see them as something other than an occupying force.
This is Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University, talking about protest, racism, and police reform with Dr. Erroll Southers of the University of Southern California as a part of our Biahad Together special series on Justice You Shall Pursue. In a few minutes, we'll be getting to your questions. Please get them ready to ask in the Q&A function. The country's problems of policing have been dramatically illustrated. You've talked about them powerfully. What should be done? And maybe if we could center it a little bit in our town, how much progress do you think the LAPD is making?
Well, I certainly would be proud of the fact of the way the department has diversified itself over the last decade. But let's all understand why perhaps part of that happened. In the 90s, late 90s, we were under consent decree. And we had to change. And what's interesting about that is some agencies in this country that have done, or I should say have reformed themselves similarly, have been under consent decrees. The challenge you have now is under the last administration, there were, I believe, 14 consent decrees to departments across the country. Since with this administration, there have been 0. And now we've seen an uptick in problems. So that's part of it. I think LAPD, certainly as we talk about women moving through the ranks, to the rank of assistant chief, deputy chief, that has been a huge increase. But then again, we still have those issues, and we always will, of those officers who abuse their power, who use excessive force. You can see the videos because they're out there. But I always have to caution people to say, let's keep things in perspective with regards to why it's happening. But I think more importantly, what we have to do is hold departments and hold chiefs accountable. And I know that they're going to hold chief more accountable. He's someone that I know. But I think LAPD has come a long way in the last decade. I think they have certainly more to do. We all have more to do. But it boils down to this: as long as we recruit from human beings in the human race to be police officers, we're going to have some imperfect people. And it's really important to make sure that we reduce the risk of hiring those imperfect people, and more importantly, retaining those people after they've had problems, after they've had complaints, and after they've performed in a way that's not consistent with the mission and values of the department.
Would you say there's a police culture which is separate, distinct from American culture, that police see themselves either threatened or not understood or at odds with their community and American society in general?
Well, Dr. Herbst, I think I would check off everything that you just said. There is definitely a police culture. And when people talk about police reform and reimagining police, we're talking about a culture here. And you're talking about a culture that unfortunately people don't join anymore. I think people look at police departments for a sense of adventure. I don't know that they necessarily look at it as I did, as a sense of service. I think that they often come out of the academy and go into the streets as warriors instead of guardians. We always stress officer safety to the point where perhaps that's putting officers in a mindset where it's above all else, which means that's the reason they're not having the verbal discourse they might normally have with someone. There's always that sense of survival when it may not be necessary. And so if you're in an environment where you're already somewhat uncomfortable and you're dealing with people that you've already perceived as being a threat, you keep adding that up. And before you know it, there's no such thing as a normal conversation, and everything results in a use of force and an escalation that sometimes winds up being tragic.
There's been a lot of criticism, a lot of antagonism to the police. Many political leaders who once described themselves as friends of the police have moved to criticize, defund the police. Someone today in your shoes, would you recommend them, if they were dedicated to a life of service, to become a police officer?
Well, I'm going to, in the interest of full disclosure, I sit here now as my son is in the background process for a police department, and he has my 100% support. It is certainly different than when I got sworn in 40 years ago. I think it's important that young men and women serve. I think it's really important that intelligent, really smart young men and women serve. So I think that's really critical. But as you mentioned previously, we have these efforts now suggesting that we defund. No one understands what that term means. To some people, it means remove all funds. To some people, it means reallocation of funds. I would suggest that we get that clear. I think one of the first things we could do, if we're going to take funding from a police department, I would strongly recommend a peer review assessment of that department to determine what their needs are. Do they need as much money as they're getting? Are we arbitrarily deciding that we're going to cut a certain amount of money from a department? We get a peer review at USC for our department and our curriculum from other university professors across the country. I would see no difference in this profession, since it is a discipline, that we would have chiefs and or command staff from other departments come in and review a department and be very honest about that. That would be something that I would like to, if I were a mayor, I'd look at doing that. And if they came back and said, they could operate on less of that budget, they need more of that budget, they don't need as many people doing this. And of course, now you have agencies across the country that are trying to come up with a hybrid of social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, rolling out to calls instead of police officers. But we live in a 911 society where people call the police for everything. And that's a challenge and a problem.
And Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University, talking with Dr. Erroll Southers about racism, police, and law enforcement reform. We'll be getting to your questions in just a few minutes, so please start submitting them through the Q&A function. As you said, there's been calls to defund the police. There have been targets. LA used to talk about 10,000 police officers. New York City used to talk about 39,000 police officers. These are shorthand, as you said, for very complex discussions about roles and functions. As this issue is at the top of the political agenda and political leaders, mayors are at tremendous pressure to do something, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges of this moment, where it seems dramatic actions are possible, but there may be consequences, perhaps some unintended?
I think the most important thing that mayors and chiefs should do is try to move toward anything that would establish a sustainable coalition with the community. Integrity and respect and trust with the community is paramount right now. So any efforts that are going to move us forward in that regard, I think are critical. Having said that, I think it's important to have a civilian review board and civilian oversight. I think it's really critical that those people who are stakeholders in the outcomes of how they're policed have a voice and a say in how it's being done and measuring whether or not it's being effective. So I don't know how departments and municipalities across America are going to bridge that gap if they don't have the people in the room that are in the community that they're trying to serve. And that would be my number one and top priority, is that conversation. But I do have to say this: the community is tired of hearing police say we need more training, because what we keep seeing is Einstein's theory play out. We keep getting more training and we seem to be having the same tragic outcomes more and more. So obviously something that we're doing is not working, and we do need to re-examine what it is and see if there's some way to repair it.
We've heard at the same time talk of a blue strike, of police officers demoralized, not feeling that political leadership would back them up on what are tough cases, as you said, often split-second decisions. Do you think that's a real phenomenon? Are we seeing a kind of pullback by some police forces, given the debates and the antagonisms over the last few weeks and months?
I won't out my sources, but I'm hearing that from colleagues who are working. I'm hearing that they don't feel supported. I'm hearing that the morale, and by the way, I want to clarify this, I'm hearing this from agencies across the county. This is not specifically LAPD. I'm hearing that morale has never been lower. And I'm not surprised to hear that. However, at the same time, there's a community frustration that has to be recognized and respected. People aren't making these things up. These things are really happening. And on that third part of that wheel are those officers who are going to work every day like they did 6 months ago, acting appropriately and responsibly as they did 6 months ago, and understanding that this is something that they're going to get through. It's going to take a lot of hard work on both parts, the community and the department. But I am hearing that this is a very challenging time. We're seeing chiefs being removed across the country. And to that, I'll only say this: we have to hold departments accountable, and you hold departments accountable by holding the chief accountable. And chiefs are appointed by mayors and city councils. And sometimes, Dr. Herbst, I'm not sure if they pick the best candidate or if they pick the person who takes the best interview. And so it's really important that to make sure you've got the right person at the helm and hold those people accountable for the way their personnel respond and perform in the field.
You've had significant international influence. We were talking before that you lecture overseas. You've obviously dealt with foreign counterparts in many of your jobs over time. Are there particular lessons from other countries which also deal with multiracial populations that the United States should pay more attention to?
As you know, I teach in the Middle East and in Israel. I teach in France. So let me look at the French example for a moment. I think it's important that those officers are in the field, in the community, and I see that over there. I see more officers coming into their ranks that represent the community. They seem to have a different level of escalation of force sometimes than we do. And I'm not quite sure why that is. It doesn't seem, and I have no data to base this on other than just pure knowledge of what I read. They don't seem to have as many questionable incidents occur as we do. So there may be a lesson learned there for us with regards to that. I also, teach in the UK, and they have personnel who are unarmed. They have personnel who are armed. That can be an advantage or disadvantage. As you know, they had a terror attack on Parliament, and that officer happened to be unarmed and unfortunately wound up victim to that attack. So there's certainly some lessons learned with regards to how they deploy, how they recruit, how they de-escalate that perhaps we might take a look at.
We're talking about racism, protest, and police reform with Dr. Erroll Southers, a law enforcement veteran. We welcome your questions, and let's go now to the questions from the audience. And we've already received 44 questions, so I think that's a compliment to you, Prof, about how informative the audience finds you. We won't be able to answer all of them. Let's get started. What role, one member of the audience asked, do the role police unions play in the problem?
That's a great question. Police unions play a huge role. And in the interest of full disclosure, you're talking to someone who used to be on the board of the police union when I was an officer. So I'll just say it this way. We'll speak specifically about California. Police unions are very influential. Police unions support a lot of legislated officials, and they're there to protect their people. I will say that under the Peace Officer Bill of Rights in the state of California, it's been described as officers having sometimes more protection and rights than suspects do. So in order for us to have any reform, the police unions are going to have to agree that reform is necessary and that they're going to be part of it. And I will say this, the LA Police Protective League, the San Francisco Police Department, and the San Jose Police Department all signed unilaterally to an agreement that they were committed to police reform. Hopefully that will take place, but the fact that they've done it at least demonstrates they recognize this is a movement and they need to be part of it. And for change to happen, they're going to have to be able to compromise on some things that perhaps were set in stone in the past.
Thank you. Another member of the audience asked, why don't problematic police departments like Minneapolis take the approach that was taken in Camden, New Jersey, where every officer has to reapply for their job, including taking psychological testing to weed out abusive officers? That's
a great question. So I can tell you that when Chief Bratton came here, the rumor was, and you can have LAPD can correct me, but I do know that he interviewed command staff who were in positions already. My impression was to determine whether or not they were going to stay there. I'll say this about Minneapolis, because I spend a lot of time there. I've been doing some research projects there for the last 6 years. Minneapolis should have been the poster child for reform. They had an indigenous gay chief, and I knew her well. They went through a Department of Justice review under the Obama administration. They came back with a settlement that said that they would never, ever put a person who was handcuffed on the ground face down as they did with George Floyd. And they currently have a black chief in Chief Arredondo, and look where they are. So all of those things being in place doesn't root out some of the systemic racism and cultural problems that an agency has. The other thing I'll say is, with all due respect to Camden, and I'm from New Jersey, I'm very familiar with Camden, it worked for them. I don't know that it would work for everyone. I'm not saying that that's not a great idea to come in and have people reapply, and I think you may see more of that in the future. But the Camden model was successful for them, and I hear it quite often, but I caution people to say that this isn't a cookie cutter approach. If you've seen one department, you've seen one department sometimes. And they have to keep that in mind as they talk about reform to make sure they don't apply a nail. I should say they don't make a hammer now for everything being a nail.
A couple of our audience members have asked about the killing of George Floyd. Let's return to that, and I'll combine a couple of the questions. One person asked, the offending officer was late to arrive but took control. Why didn't the other officers intervene? And another audience member notes, the officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck was a field training officer training new officers. How could someone like that be assigned to train new officers?
So two great questions. Let me give you a little bit of history. One of those officers who was there, his name is King, it's spelled K-O, I believe it's K-O-E-N-G, who happens to be black. He was the responding officer. It was their call. He was Chauvin's trainee. So you could see that when Chauvin arrived with his partner, the alpha male took over, which is very common in police culture. And therein lies a huge part of the problem, is that when Chauvin came in, they put Mr. Floyd on the ground face down. He kneeled on his neck and those other three just helped or stood by. Again, the culture. With respect to, and I think the second part of your question was, how do they let him train someone?
Right.
That, again, not just, that's a great question that I can't answer, but I will say this, not only is he training people, but here's an officer with 17 or 18 complaints over a period of time. And one of the reasons that the 3rd precinct was burned to the ground is because the rumor is that that precinct was a home for rogue officers. And they were known to behave like that. Chauvin was not the exception, he was the rule. And they basically terrorized that neighborhood they were in. And so when the opportunity presented itself after Mr. Floyd's death, when the violence started, they burned that station to the ground. And so it wasn't by happenstance. They did that because they targeted it because of all of the mistreatment they had endured under some of those officers for years that went unresponded to. And the department has an exceptionally high rate of exonerating officers when they were accused of misconduct.
One of the challenges of police reform is due to the federal system in the United States, law enforcement is highly localized with literally thousands, I guess, of police forces across the country. Given no national police force, how does reform become something more than particular projects in particular cities championed by individuals to become something systemic across the country?
That's a good question. And I think the answer to that is going to be legislation. And to some point, at some point, there will have to be some kind of centralization when it comes to standards, use of force, disqualifying the use of the carotid chokehold. Those are things that I think could be universally accepted across 50 states. We'll see if that happens. But your point is well taken. I mean, I'm going to obviously champion California and what we call POST, the Peace Officer Standards and Training, which I think is the nation's best. People are trained. I can tell you as an assistant chief when I was at the airport, I usually had more people in training than I had in the field or on vacation at one time because training is constant. It's done, it's documented, they're certified. Why other states don't do that, I don't know. We have different standards when it comes to screening and hiring across the country. We have different standards, obviously, when it comes to discipline, and particularly when it comes to officers who are fired. There's an officer in New Jersey right now who's 31 years old. He's on his 9th department. He has been fired from 5 other departments, and one of those departments was Camden, and he's still working. And I hate to say this, he's still working, probably, and you haven't heard of him probably because he hasn't killed anybody yet. Why do we allow that to happen?
This is Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University, talking with Dr. Erroll Southers about racism, protest, and police reform. Another question the audience asks, is the issue of police violence because of poor hiring practices, training practices, or learned behavior by officers once out on patrol? Or is it all three? How do we address issues of officers already in the field that are known by their departments to have issues with aggressive behavior?
That's a great question. So unfortunately, sometimes it's a combination of all three. I'm going to say that screening, I work backgrounds, and I believe that in most cases, you're going to certainly screen out people who shouldn't be there, but it's not always absolute. It's a learned behavior sometimes, that's for sure. But then what's more important, and I really appreciate the question, is when someone is involved in an act that's within policy. And the challenge here, Dr. Herbst, is that Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's necessary. And so what happens with these officers is they engage in typically a use of force that by department policy is permissible, but may not have been necessary. So the officer is exonerated because he's within policy. So that's a huge part of the problem. And they're retained. And you wind up with a Chauvin with 18 complaints over X number of years because none of them have ever been sustained and he's never ever been meted out any discipline.
How do you explain Black Lives Matter and the demands of that movement to your colleagues in law enforcement?
That's a good question. So one of the things I always have to qualify with people and in some of my colleagues is that Black Lives Matter is not a zero-sum proposition. It doesn't mean that other lives don't matter. It means that we've reached a time in history where acknowledge that my life matters too. And so that's a huge part of the problem. It's almost as misunderstood as Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem. That very few people know that he was not going to kneel, but at the suggestion or recommendation of a Green Beret, he said, that's what I think you should do if you really want to show your discontent and protest police brutality. And he did. So Black Lives Matter is saying, is particularly to law enforcement, treat us as you would treat someone who looks like you. That time is long past. And that's why this movement is so critical in saying, look, recognize me for being a human being at this point in history. We know that historically this nation has always espoused those beliefs, but it's never been real. And the wake-up call for America since George Floyd is to understand just how unreal it's been for people who look like me. And to have them think, for example, as I had the talk, quote unquote, with my kids, you know, I had to explain to my son, and at the time I was in the FBI, that because dad's an FBI agent doesn't mean when you get stopped, you're not going to get treated like somebody else who looks like you. So that's why we have a Black Lives Matter. And I would have thought, my dream was that having that talk with my son would be, I might be the last generation that would have to have that talk. Well, I have a grandson now, and unfortunately my son's going to have that talk with him.
Another one of our audience asks, following from that powerful answer, what can we as individuals, you've talked about chiefs and mayors, but as individuals to end systemic racism and police brutality against African Americans?
I think that many people are finally doing it. It's all about educating yourself. It's about listening to these stories and not suggesting that they're a hoax, that they're real. I made the comment earlier in our session here about behaviors not getting worse, but cell phone technology getting better. These are things that I've known about, witnessed, and been victim of my entire life when people would suggest, nah, it couldn't have been that bad. People now really realize that it's that bad. So what can you do? Acknowledge that, show some empathy. Most importantly, and I say this as seriously as I can, do whatever you can to be a good human being. And I don't think that that's going to take a whole lot of effort to define what that really is. If people would just be good human beings, we'd have a start then to educating ourselves, to having that conversation, to realizing that we all have challenges, that we all have fears. But if we could just respect each other, that would be a start. But it really is about acknowledging what is happening in the country that we aren't taught on purpose as it relates to people of color and as it relates to people who live in communities that are outside of their own.
Do you think other police officers would have intervened in George Floyd's killing? Was it those three in the moment? Did that surprise you? Did that not surprise you?
Again, I'm going to, looking at that specific case, there was a hierarchy in place there, and so when I found that out, it didn't surprise me. It didn't surprise me at first because I just figured Minneapolis police culture, but once I did a little bit of background on who was there, it explained itself in a crystal clear way. Chauvin was the alpha male. He was the training officer. One of those other three was a trainee of his, that it was his third time out on patrol by himself. So it became abundantly apparent with regards to the behavior that took place out there, why he was able to do what he did, why the other three acquiesced to him and no one did nothing. And they killed George Floyd and watched and waited and made it happen.
Another audience member writes, following up from the same question, is there a significant difference between behaviors of female and male officers? They get the same kind of assignments? Do they act the same way in incidents?
So whoever sent that question, and I'm smiling because Dr. Herbst and I had this very conversation before we went on. One of the studies that I would love for my center at USC to do would be to answer your question. I don't have any data, so I always go with this thought. Any person who doesn't have data is just somebody with an opinion, so this is an opinion. I find it interesting and coincidental, and you know what they say about the term coincidence, it takes a lot of planning, that whenever you have these incidents of shootings, excessive force, let's be specific, people of color getting killed by law enforcement, they rarely involve female officers. When female officers make just as many arrests, usually of people their size or larger, quite often, they have sometimes the same kinds of fights that male officers have with people, and yet we don't see the deadly force incidents, we don't see those tragedies happening at the hands of these female officers. That is a great question, and I don't believe that that is a coincidence. I believe that female officers have a way to deal with people that's different. I think they've mastered the art in some cases of de-escalation, and we could certainly learn something from how they deal with people on a regular basis, and male officers don't, because I just believe there's something there and we need to find out what it is. I love that question. Thank you.
We're getting to the end of our time, and I know, Prof, that you have a lot of demands on you right now, and we're grateful for the time you spent with us.
Well, thank you.
This is a particular moment that's mobilized the country. Enormous amount of attention has been focused on policing, probably more so than in any moment in decades, if not ever. If we were to get together again, and I hope we will many times, let's say we got together again in a couple of years and we said, wow, we made the most of this moment. What would you like to have seen occur?
I would have liked to have seen peer review assessments of departments. I would like to see cities with civilian review boards with real power, as in subpoena power and investigative power. I would like to see a registry of terminated or officers who resign because of misconduct so they can't be hired anyplace else. I'd like to see those officers decertified so they can't work anywhere else. With all due respect, not everybody can be a police officer, nor should they be. And last but not least, I'd like to believe that some kind of holistic, comprehensive response system could be implemented that for those real nonviolent calls, you're not sending an officer with a firearm. We've got to get away from the 911 mentality we have in America. You call a police officer for everything from a traffic accident to a fight, to a loose dog, to somebody's sprinkler who gets your car wet. We have to stop doing that. And I think we're not only just wasting resources, we're taking away, officers are trained to keep the peace. We'd like them to do that. For people who have better skill sets in dealing with special populations, mental illness community, disabled community, and sometimes if it's nonviolent, we should be sending those experts. We have the talent in America. Let's send our best talent to those calls so people have the best resources and we can have the most probable and important outcome instead of sending the hammer because everything becomes a nail.
This is Jeffrey Herbst, President of American Jewish University. I've been talking with Professor Erroll Southers about racism, protest, and law enforcement reform. Prof, thank you so much for joining us. We know how valuable your time is right now, how many demands, how much research you're doing. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you about the issues that are gripping the country right now. And your perspective based on decades of service at various levels of law enforcement, I think has been valuable to the audience. I've never seen 72 questions in the Q&A function of a Zoom webinar, and that suggests, I think, how powerful the audience has found you and how informative you've been. I'd like to thank you for that and thank you for the insights you've provided. To the audience, I hope that you'll come back to AJU often. Our Biachad Together series will offer almost every day of the week. We take 1 or 2 days off, informative and educational programs. You can find all of our programs at aju.edu. Erroll, thanks so very much. Thanks for this program, and thanks for the research and service that you've been doing.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve, and I really appreciate being on your program. Thank you.
Thank you.